Phoenix Suns playoff hopes seemingly rest on the literal shoulders of Chris Paul, and in this video we're going to do a little update on the guard's health. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. With everything we've seen and looking back at the original injury, I still feel strongly that this was a stinger, or essentially a nerve injury. Of course, the Suns are still officially calling it a contusion, but we have seen reports from sources inside the team that it was a stinger. Let's tease some of that apart, and then I want to really dive into what's going on when somebody has a stinger injury in terms of what happens to the nerves and that whole healing process and timeline. You can think of a contusion as a bruise or an injury that's a result of some traumatic compression or hit to the affected tissue. Looking back at the original play, I can't convince myself that there was any significant impact to the shoulder itself. Here from the side, this is when the head makes contact with Johnson, but you can see here there's really no significant impact to Chris Paul's right shoulder. It really does seem like his head and then the neck twisting and bending there absorbs all that contact. When we talk about other injuries to the shoulder joint with things like a labrum or a shoulder subluxation where the shoulder wants to almost dislocate partially, for those types of injuries we have to have some sort of insult or excessive movement of the arm typically that causes that humerus to want to displace outside of the joint. And again, in that scenario, really his arm doesn't seem to catch much impact here. We certainly don't see it extend back into that classic extended, kind of abducted, rotated position where we think of a shoulder subluxation. From this back view, we can again see that all the impact is directly to the side of Paul's head and really nothing directly to that shoulder or to the arm. So I still feel like from looking at this mechanism that this was probably a nerve type injury. I don't see enough here for a contusion or shoulder joint. After the initial impact, honestly, the biggest evidence for me is how Paul responded when he was on the court. That first instinct of where he grabbed, up by his neck, up in his trapezius muscle. If you've got a shoulder joint injury, you would grab at the shoulder joint. There'd be no reason to grab higher up if you were dealing with a injury like a subluxation, a labral tear, a contusion out to the shoulder. He's grabbing right up in the area where a stinger injury would occur. And then when we see him on the ground, he's rubbing up and down his arm. He still is not grabbing at his shoulder. He's opening and closing his hand, kind of like when you hit your funny bone and have that nerve type feeling. Here from the top, he's kind of grabbing that bicep. He's not at all responding like I would expect someone who's had just a injury to the shoulder joint itself. If this all turns out to really be more of a shoulder joint or a shoulder soft tissue problem, it'll be one of the strangest responses I've seen from an athlete on the court after that type of an injury. Now, there is some wiggle room with how the Suns are labeling this a shoulder contusion. If we look at our biodigital anatomy tool here, what I've done is show the trapezius muscle, the deltoid, the biceps, and then some of the muscles in the back side of the shoulder. But I've also highlighted the brachial plexus and the nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord that are injured or involved whenever somebody has a stinger. It's pretty easy when we see an injury over here to say shoulder, and it's pretty easy when we see an injury here to say neck. But when we get into this kind of middle area where a stinger injury occurs, you're kind of between the neck, you're kind of between the shoulder, and so saying shoulder here could still be the location where we'd see a stinger injury. Also with the mechanism of Paul's injury where his neck went over to the right side and then extended backwards, that's going to cause compression of these nerve roots and of the brachial plexus. And so essentially a bruise, a sort of compression injury that I could see somebody still describing as a contusion. The nerve is contused. So even though the Suns are calling this a shoulder contusion, technically I could see how a stinger with this mechanism would still fit that description of a shoulder contusion. In game 2, we saw Paul with some taping on his right shoulder, and honestly, when I see things like this, it's very non-specific. To me, this is just implying that they're trying to give some additional stability to the shoulder because honestly, when somebody has a stinger, you can feel like you've got a contusion or a bruise in the shoulder because of the distribution of those nerves. These taping patterns are a dime a dozen and everybody's going to do it a little bit differently. So there's nothing specific or sensitive that I see here with this taping pattern that says one injury versus the other. The tough thing is for a stinger, there's really not much that you can do beyond some physical therapy to try to loosen any tight muscles, strengthen some of the muscles around the neck, but there's not really that much hands-on active treatment that you can do to encourage the recovery of a nerve injury. So they're going to try different things to get him more comfortable and to give him some more confidence and stability feeling in that shoulder. Let's think to what's really bothering Chris Paul. It's shooting, so when he's raising, or what we'd call abducting that right arm, making passes, so when he has to again extend that right arm. And so it's primarily actions that involved activation of what we would call the proximal muscles of the arm, or the muscles closer up to the shoulder. As we get farther away from the body, that's distal, and when we get closer to the body, that's proximal. And when we think of our typical stinger injuries, most of them occur to the 5th or the 6th cervical nerve roots up here, or the upper trunk of the brachial plexus. So basically somewhere in this region of that nerve structure. And this 5th and 6th nerve root and this upper trunk go on to innervate the muscles of the proximal arm. So the deltoid, the supraspinatus, that's going to lift the arm up, your biceps a little bit. And so all the muscles that seem to be bothering Chris Paul when he tries to use them are the muscles that are typically involved in terms of nerve innervation with a classic stinger injury. The severity of a stinger is defined by how much trauma there is to the structure of the nerve, which of course influences the ultimate time of recovery. By far, the majority of stingers result in almost no time missed because they resolve within a matter of minutes. But depending on the severity, they can extend for days to weeks. One study looking at a group of young rugby players found that 80% had their symptoms resolve within a day, but 6% required 2 weeks for full neurologic recovery. This graphic is the general structure of a nerve, and while this is really more the brain with all these different neurons, it illustrates the point for a peripheral nerve like a stinger. The highway, or the wire, so to speak, of a nerve is called the axon. And then that axon is wrapped with something called myelin. This myelin wraps around the axon and helps to provide some protection, some insulation, but also helps with that conduction of the electrical signal down the nerve. A grade 1 stinger results in something called neuropraxia. This is when there's just compression of this myelin, sometimes some damage to the myelin, but no actual injury to the axon. So no cutting of that wire, no trauma to that wire, just some injury to that outer kind of insulative covering. But what this does is it causes what we call a conduction block, where it's harder for that electrical signal to conduct down the axon, which gives you the resulting weakness, numbness, pain, and symptoms with a stinger injury. A more severe grade 2 stinger is going to be something called Axonal Temesis. With this, you have actual injury to that wire, to the axon, and it's going to take longer for those to recover because you've damaged more of that nerve pathway. But the actual covering, or what we call epineurium of the nerve, is still intact, and so there's potential for that nerve to still heal and connect up again. But then a grade 3, or the most severe, is going to be called Neurotomesis. This is basically the equivalent of taking a pair of scissors and just completely cutting that nerve in half. If this is truly a stinger, Paul is likely just dealing with a grade 1 where there's been some compression and damage to this myelin. And that myelin can take on the order of days to weeks to ultimately repair itself and get back to a normal state. So for Paul, it's now been 5 days since his initial injury, and he really should be getting to that point where this is starting to recover. I think he looked better in game 3 than he did in game 2, and so hopefully game 4 he's even better, game 5 even better. And we'll hear Paul say things like he's getting treatment 24/7 around the clock, but there's not really much that you can do to encourage the healing and recovery of a nerve. Yeah, they'll do some topical stuff, they'll work on some stretching, some strengthening, but none of that is actually making this nerve heal quicker. It's a matter of time for it to heal. To conclude all this, yes, of course it's possible that I'm wrong here and this is not a nerve injury. But you guys are here for my opinion on this, and when I look at the mechanism, the footage, what Paul's been doing since, and just piece the anatomy together, I still agree with what we've seen from these sources within the Suns organization about this being a stinger. That's it for this video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.